Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Talli Yehuda Rosenbaum. She is an individual and couple therapist, as well as a certified sex therapist. She co-hosts the Intimate Judaism podcast and is co-author of the book, I Am For My Beloved, a guide to enhanced intimacy for married couples. Please note that parts of this episode are sexually graphic, albeit in a professional manner. Listener discretion is advised. Enjoy my conversation with Talli Yehuda Rosenbaum. Talli, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. Looking forward to this podcast episode. Before we get into the great work that you're doing today, you have a book, you have courses, you have a podcast, you have a practice. Why don't you give us a peek behind the curtain of where you came from and basically everything that led to where you are today?
I grew up in the United States and educated in a very Orthodox, in a regular Orthodox, modern Orthodox home, and went to college in the United States, got married, made Aliyah. We have 4 children, several grandchildren, so that's on a personal level. I am today a therapist, an individual therapist, a couples therapist, and a certified sex therapist and a supervisor for people who want to know more about how to incorporate issues of intimacy and sexuality in their regular practices with their individuals and couples. So I do provide supervision as well. And people like to know how I got into the field of sexual health and also into the field of psychotherapy. So my journey into psychotherapy is not at all the classic one. I did not begin my career in mental health. I began my career as a physical therapist. And I worked several years as a physical therapist, and I specialized in an area of physical therapy, which very much kind of overlapped with sexual health and intimacy, because I was working in women's health and women would come to me with issues having to do with their pelvic floor, which is part of the female anatomy. And with that, the difficulties that come along with sexuality, sexual pain, and that sort of thing. In the course of my work, I was encountering a lot of women who, the kind of things that I heard as a physical therapist really disturbed me. The approaches that people had to sexuality, particularly in the world that I was immersed in, particularly with young Orthodox women who were just kind of starting on their way because they were just married. And many of the tropes that I was hearing were very anxious statements of, I have to make this work. I have to be able to have sex. If I don't have sex, something very bad will happen. This kind of attitude where I don't need to enjoy it. I just have to do it. Often patients would literally go into these traumatic responses in my office. They would disassociate because of all the trauma that they were experiencing trying to do this deed, which sounded like this very ominous, scary, expected to be painful rite of passage into marriage, which is really not how it should be or how I thought it should be. And it was really disturbing to me. What was also disturbing to me was that people would come and open up and really have a lot of questions about their own sexuality and about their relationships, which as a physical therapist, as insightful as I was kind of on just an instinctual level, I really did not have the skills. And so at a certain point, also after I've kind of had enough of the work that I was doing, I went back to school, I retrained, and I became a psychotherapist, an individual and couples therapist, and kind of changed hats, so to speak. And that's also it's really fulfilling to be able to help people. I don't only do sex therapy. I became a therapist who kind of does what every other therapist does. If you're kind of picturing what it looks like in an office, tell me more about that and all that stuff. But that's really the main stuff that I'm doing today, is sitting with individuals or couples in my clinic and talking to them and doing the therapy process.
And so let's talk about the couples for a second. Is that a wide variety of couples, or are those mainly Orthodox, modern Orthodox? What's the
Well,
spectrum
there's a
there?
wide variety of couples in terms of the couples dynamics that I see. There's a wide variety of couples in terms of, whether couples are, openly hostile or quietly passive aggressive, or the different dynamics that they come in with. In terms of culture, there is a spectrum within the Orthodox community and also non-Orthodox, obviously, but I would say the majority of my practice is Jewish, just because I live in Israel. I've had a couple of not Jewish couples, but mostly Jewish and mostly Orthodox.
So, let's talk about Orthodox couples. Obviously, you're not going to name any names, but there's a lot of stigmas about Orthodox marriage, Orthodox families, Orthodox sex. Can you maybe call out a few very common misconceptions and things that you've seen that sort of dispel them?
Well, I think that Orthodox sex has kind of been fetishized. It's been in the media, and people sometimes have a almost kinky interest in knowing more about what goes on in the bedroom of Orthodox people. My sense is, from years of working in this field, people are people, and every human being has the desire to connect. We all long for intimacy. We all long for connection. And that's something that I really see throughout humanity. Whatever you're wearing on your head, or whether you have, side curls or that kind of thing. I think that we really do need to look at the fact that people are people and are wired to connect in a certain way. We all want safety. We all want to be able to be vulnerable. We all want to be able to experience closeness, connection, and pleasure. So everybody's kind of the same in terms of wanting to make the most out of their intimate lives together. What is true is that there is a lot there. What is true is that there's less openness to variations than there might be in the world at large. So if you are Orthodox, or especially if you are ultra Orthodox, and you're LGBT, for example, you're going to be faced with a real conflict. And I think that these conflicts exist for LGBTQ population, even who aren't ultra Orthodox. But imagine that if you want to stay in a mainstream ultra Orthodox community, it's going to be really, really hard. So what I come up against a lot is the need to integrate these parts, but sometimes they can't, because it's either you give up this or you give up that. So that's kind of a common thing. There's been some talk lately about, whether it's true or not that forced marriage is a thing, or arranged marriage is a thing. And I think that there are still communities where young people are, I would use the word encouraged, but I would even say, I don't know how much consent is involved here. And we often see young people who are married well before they're ready, because that's part of the norms of the society. And that definitely creates kind of this coercive experience of sexuality for both partners, not just for the young man and young woman involved. So we do see that. And a lot of these issues, by the way, we talk about on our podcast, Intimate Judaism, that I do together with Rabbi Scott Kahn. And that is, by the way, if you're talking about the future of Jewish, the present and future of Jewish is that things that have never been talked about in any sort of public forum, at least not in any kind of Orthodox public forum, we're doing in our podcast, Intimate Judaism, where we cover LGBTQ, we cover premarital sex, we cover, the whole aspects surrounding Taharat HaMishpacha, which are the laws related to family purity, Nida laws that have to do with a woman's menstruation and the need to separate sexually or cease all physical intimacy for that portion of time, and 7 days thereafter, then the woman immerses in a mikvah, and all that brings to the marriage. We discuss sexuality, sexual issues. I invite you all to look at our podcast, Intimate Judaism. We've gotten tremendous feedback. We've helped a lot of people. We have listeners who are Hasidim from Williamsburg, from all over the world, actually. And we also have people who consider themselves pretty liberal who enjoy the podcast as well.
So,
long answer.
No, that's okay. I want to pick it apart a little bit, because I understand that, on one hand, people are people, humans are humans, and we all sort of have the same makeup in many ways. On the other hand, they always say that you're a product of your environment. And so I'm just wondering, like, what are some of the unique attributes of an Orthodox couple in terms of intimacy and sexual intimacy that maybe sort of more secular, more liberal, more even non-Jewish couples likely don't experience?
Yeah, so I think you're asking a great question, and I'm just going to preface my answer with the following. When it comes to sexuality, we have kind of the macro view and we have the micro view. So let's understand that I'm a clinician, and as a clinician, my clinical samples that I could talk about are the people that come to my office. And so my data is skewed by the fact that it is a clinical sample. This doesn't really give me sufficient, I would say, I wouldn't necessarily base what I have to say on data that has been studied. You're asking me a question which is more academic, more sociological, and really does require data. Now, I'm not saying that I haven't done that work. There are some studies that we have done. We have looked at, my colleagues and I were one of the first to look at sexual functioning and sexual satisfaction in Orthodox Jewish women. And the study can be found on my website underneath the publications. And so we do need more data to demonstrate what are the unique findings amongst Orthodox couples in terms of their sexual dynamics, their sexual health. So what I'm going to say is really based on anecdotal evidence from the knowledge of the people that speak to me and the people that I see. And I can also tell you a little bit about what I speak about when I speak to audiences of secular and non-Jewish people who want to understand more about sexuality and Judaism and sexual health and traditional to Orthodox Judaism. So basically, there are three main, I would say, fundamental core values, right? So there's family purity, okay? There's sexual exclusivity, and there's also modesty. And based on these three values, we're going to see some differences in the population of religious people and their sexuality. Also because there's a very unique developmental process around sexuality, in the sense that if you have values that say sexuality is not relevant, or let me be more clear, sexual behavior is not relevant. Sexuality is always relevant. Sexuality is relevant from the day you're born. We're sexual human beings. Sexuality is part of the self. When I say self, I mean we're made up of different aspects of the self: spiritual self, cognitive self, physical self, emotional self, and sexual self. Okay, our sexuality is a part of us. But the idea of integrating that part of us with the fact that sexual behavior is basically prohibited until after marriage, this is going to present with great conflict around sexuality, conflict around arousal, conflict around masturbation, even conflict around, certainly premarital sexual activity, even if it isn't intercourse, even if it's other stuff. So certainly part of, I would say, almost the existential issue around sexuality when working with Orthodox people is the understanding that there's a transition from this kind of lack of entitlement to really give focus to sexuality, or give a place to acknowledge, to celebrate, to enjoy sexuality. And then this transition is now you're married, and often it can be experienced as great. Now I can express this part of me, and it can be done in a healthy transitional way, but often it's not. Often it feels like a very dissonant, a cognitively dissonant move from, this place of abstinence, kind of keeping to something that is not sexual or even asexual, this avoidance of sexuality, to suddenly feeling like this is something I have to do. And I think that it is far more binary, the farther to the right that you get in terms of society, because the societies that are more insular manage to have really less access to anything sexual. So that transition can feel really, really jarring. As you are talking about more modern societies, and they're more gender mixed societies, and there may be some more experiences with partners, then it may feel less jarring, but there may be a lot of guilt associated with past activity. So these are kind of the issues that come up around sexuality in my practice, and what we talk about on Intimate Judaism.
Is there one sort of common thread or common theme that you've noticed, not necessarily in every single patient or in every single couple, but in the vast majority?
Well, look, I think that if you had to reduce it, and sex and sexuality and sexual health is so not easily reducible, because when we talk about sexuality, we're talking about so many different parts. There's the intimacy relational part, and that has to do with your ability to connect, your social skills, your vulnerability, your ability to be empathic and compassionate. That's not specifically sexual, but it has to do with developing a framework, a relational place for sexuality to take place. It has to do with your values and beliefs around sex. So if you have values that say that, you need to be modest, or, some kind of lack of modesty might be responsible for male arousal, that kind of thing, then that certainly is an aspect that can give you feelings of guilt and burden. And for women, for example, so like I would say that there are several. It's really hard to reduce it to one, but if I had to reduce it to one, I would say conflict. The conflict between the sense of self that I see myself in, and kind of trying to navigate sexuality in a healthy way within the values that I believe in. So I want to be able to say that I'm going to transition into being a sexual human being, and I'm going to experience sexuality in this beautiful way that the Torah, wants us to do, and wants us to have, to not just procreate, but the Ketubah specifically states that a man has an obligation to provide his wife with sex and with sexual pleasure. So we look at Judaism in a big way as being kind of quote unquote sex positive, so to speak, and that sexual behavior is encouraged and looked at in a positive way between married couples, obviously, and at the right time, obviously. But often, even with that knowledge, which is mostly cognitive knowledge, it's not an embodied experience. When I say embodied, it's not necessarily something that you feel in your body. What you may feel in your body because of guilt with arousal, or guilt about sexual curiosity, or guilt about sexual experiences, or perhaps even, traumatic experiences or sexual abuse. All of those things can create this situation where the wiring into being sexual feels conflicted. So people might say, it feels good, but it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right to the person that I am. It feels dirty, or I might hear it feels guyish. This is something that the non-Jews do. It's not a Jewish thing to do, even though I know cognitively that it's beautiful and that it's wonderful. So I would say the big headline is that there's often a conflict with how do I integrate my sexuality in a way that is guilt-free, that is part of me, that I'm happy about, that I'm proud of. I may not necessarily talk to everybody in the street about it because of modesty. So it's just mine, but how do I integrate that? And very often it's difficult. It's more difficult for men because they're more aware of their sexuality, let's say growing up. Women are too, but often less so. And so they've been kind of dealing with sexuality, and when they experienced with conflict and guilt. So that transition into this is okay now and you don't have to feel conflict and guilt can be a source of distress. For women, I think the main source of distress, or often the source of distress, is the feeling of sex as an obligation, as something that they are required to do. And I think that one thing that we have tried to do with our podcast is really kind of debunk the myth that sexuality should be anything obligatory, should be anything other than completely mutual and completely consensual. Because there traditionally hasn't been a lot of talk about consent. And so we have really tried very hard to work that in, and I work that in very much in the work that I do.
So there's two things I want to pull apart there. The first one is the conflict. And I know it's very circumstantial and contextual in terms of, how you address a certain couple or a certain type of personality. If you're talking to the man, if you're talking to the woman, if you're talking to them as a couple. But to the extent that you can, what are some of the sort of hows of advice and steps to be taken that you offer when dealing with that conflict that you talked about?
Sure. Well, one of the most important, I would say, outcomes of any therapy process is the acquisition of self-awareness. Self-awareness and self-compassion, and kind of creating this connection with yourself and this understanding of yourself is critical, because when you think about what is today a very common experience of young people who are prohibited to kind of be curious about sex, to find out more, to experience their sexuality, whether it's through self-stimulation or other ways. What ends up happening a lot because of the easy access to internet and to sources, what we have is a lot of splitting. And when I say splitting, what I mean is that often we'll have young people, young men, but also young women, who experience themselves in every way as completely, I would say, loyal to their spiritual selves, completely normative, religious, but there's a part that is at the core fundamentally very healthy. Sexual curiosity, the desire to know, the desire to experience pleasure. So these are all very healthy aspects, but in the absence of any way to somehow indulge that or somehow be able to experience that, they often will go to porn, or they'll hook up or do other things kind of on the down low. And so that creates kind of this split sense of themselves. Now, a healthy way in life is to kind of integrate it. I'm not perfect. I do believe in God and I believe in being religious, but I'm human and I can't keep everything 100%. So I'm not going to be Shomer Negia. Shomer Negia means like you do not touch at all the members of the opposite sex. And so, that's too hard for me, or especially if I'm an older single and I didn't get married at 19. So there's, I think, a better integration today, especially in the more modern Orthodox world, that, you can kind of integrate the different parts of yourself, including the sexual self with your spiritual self. But what we end up seeing a lot is this kind of split. So I have this part of me and it's a bad part of me. And it's something that I kind of do. And when do I want to do it? And what compels me to do it? And when do I feel triggered to do it? And what are my feelings around doing it? And then I'm angry at myself for doing it. And I'm angry at the poster of the woman who dressed that way that made me want to do it. It's kind of really going deeply into areas of culture, because there's toxic misogyny at the core of a lot of this, this belief that, you made me do this because, you showed your cleavage to me, how dare you? And kind of really working on the agency and the autonomy and the feelings of, I choose my behavior. And most religious people are kind of dedicated to the idea of choosing your behavior. And so it really speaks to them to be able to do a process where they can understand their sexuality is something that they choose as well. It's often important reframing, because a lot of the messaging is that you have to avoid everything because you can't trust yourself. And so that's not good messaging. We want to really, if we're talking about the future of Jewish, part of that is being able to educate, to re-educate, and to talk about sexuality in a way that is empowering, in a way that looks at values and beliefs, and also looks at the fact that we are all sexual human beings from the time we are born. And this offers an opportunity too, to be able to say, if you choose to engage in sexual behavior, this is what you need to know. You need to know about consent, and you need to know about boundaries. You need to know about the ethics of sexual behavior, even if you're choosing to, quote unquote, break the halacha, to not go along with Jewish law exactly. But you still need to know what to do. And that's another thing that I see a lot, are single people who engage in sexual behavior, and they can get STDs, or they can get pregnant, or they can often do a lot of things that they didn't even really want to do because they didn't know that they can say, yeah, I did that once. I was curious and I wanted to try, but I don't want to do that every time. They don't know the rules.
I want to get to the part about consent that you talked about, but you brought up something else first that I want to ask you about, which is sort of the taboos. I mean, you mentioned porn as sort of one of the obvious ones, but I had a friend growing up who his parents wouldn't let him eat, him and his brothers and sisters, sugar, right? Artificial sugar. And so, he got to a certain age where all of a sudden we're going to the mall by ourselves and we're going to the candy store. And what happens, the rest of us friends are just getting a regular amount of candy because we're allowed to eat candy. And he's getting double, triple the amount because he's overcompensating, right? And I'm just curious, do you see that type of thing in the Orthodox Jewish community among couples, mainly among the men maybe, or maybe also among the women? Or is it really circumstantial? I mean, how do you see that?
Not in the way that you described. In other words, I don't look at it as an overcompensation. I think that there is something about porn that is universal, in the sense that, and I'm going to talk about men for now, but I think that this can be applicable to women as well, although I think that Often they're looking for something different there. But I think that because of a society that doesn't necessarily value teaching men the way they teach women, or modeling male behavior around vulnerability or around emotional expression. And we call that toxic masculinity. Men can do two things. They can get angry, or they can get, horny. In other words, a lot of men kind of internalize this belief that no emotions are really okay to have or express. And so there's a couple ways they can express them: by getting angry, or getting aggressive, maybe in sports, and also sexualizing their feelings. And so much of the therapy process is often understanding, what are the feelings? How do you try to soothe them? Sexualizing them is kind of a way to soothe yourself, but it's not necessarily about sex. It's about the way that you soothe yourself. Because it's sex, it has an added taboo to it. But if there was a behavior that was about sports or gambling or anything that was excessive, we would want to treat it in a similar way. Unfortunately, when it becomes to sex, it becomes about the sex. You're addicted, you're a lust addict, you're a sex addict. There's a lot of negativity that gets put on the sex, which is a shame, because sexual health is really about being able to accept your sexual parts, your sexuality in a positive way, and not link it to out of control behavior. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it does. I was just thinking, I love how you're just shedding light on things that many people are wondering about. They don't, like you said, there's not a lot of information, data, especially out there. I want to ask you now about the consent part, because I know that's a huge part of this. And what can you share with us about, how you deal with couples that maybe there wasn't so much consent, at the outset, so to speak?
First of all, I think we need to recognize that if there was not consent at the outset, and also I want to talk about consent, what that means, because most of the time they'll say there was consent. In other words, the agreement to get married, to have sex, is kind of almost an implied consent. There's almost an entitlement to that wedding night sex, or the mikvah night sex, or these other times that you have sex. And this entitlement, by the way, is not biblical. It's not rabbinic. It's not a Jewish value that you're entitled to sex regardless of what your partner wants. It's just kind of been understood that way, unfortunately. Part of the reason is that if you've been to yeshiva, or if you've grown up in any kind of Orthodox society, you will understand that you are not supposed to spill seed, that you're not supposed to masturbate, you're not supposed to spill seed. What happens is that there's an anxiety around the idea of spilling seed, and this creates a situation whereby the assumption is that the woman is available when the man needs, in order that he not spill seed. Now, when you hear this, it sounds crazy. It sounds like that can't possibly be the case. But it is. In certain societies, this is still how it's taught. And part of why this is changing, is because people are talking about it. And we've been doing podcasts about it, and we've been talking about it openly. I have a chapter that I wrote that also is in Hebrew and in English, in a conference book. The Kolech is a organization for Orthodox feminists, and I gave a talk and was asked to write it up, and it's called I Am His Vessel, and it's the experiences of women who feel objectified by the need to be available for their partners when their partners need it, in order that they not spill seed. This is something that can happen, that can become a real big problem, and can also result in trauma. And so this is kind of what brought me to, that's really what encouraged my path into mental health, because when I was a physical therapist and I was treating women who were having difficulty with penetrative intercourse, they would say, look, I don't have to like it. It just has to not hurt me so much, because I have to be able to be there to, when my husband needs me, in order that he not spill seed. This is a very, very difficult belief. And part of what I and many, many other educators, therapists, activists really in the field of sexuality have been doing is kind of looking at this and speaking about what consent really means. And if a woman says, I consent to have you do what you have to do with my body because I realize that I don't have a choice, that's not consent. You can't give consent if you don't really believe that you have a choice. So for some people, this might require speaking to rabbis, and that's great if there are rabbis, who understand mental health and understand the effect and how it can be traumatic anytime you feel that you don't have a choice. And it's also traumatic for men to feel like they don't have a choice but to coerce their wives into having intercourse when they don't want it or have pain with it. So I often will end up seeing couples where both of them are pretty traumatized by that belief. And I think as a result of that, you'll find rabbis today and you'll find Kala instructors today who are far more verbal about not pushing it, taking your time. Nothing is going to happen. And if there's ejaculation outside, and by the way, you might want to put a little warning at the beginning of this podcast that it's going to be graphic. But if that happens outside the vagina, that's okay. And we've discussed this also on our podcast where Rabbi Khan brought sources to back this up. And so kind of busting those myths has been an important part of our work, because unfortunately those myths have been oppressive. And as I said, not just to women, but to their partners as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'm wondering, there seems to be a trend in certainly the more Orthodox, more religious Jewish communities where women are starting to find their voice and starting to really, I don't want to use the word power, but, starting to really come into their own, if you will. We see that in a lot of different ways. We know that historically, in general, the world in general has been very male oriented. We know that Judaism is also a product of that in many ways. I'm wondering, what have you seen in terms of the evolution of your practice and the experiences that you've shared with your patients? Have you seen that same dynamic where women are really starting to more come into their own, to find their voice, to stand up for themselves, to share their feelings and sort of their side of the equation in the same ways that maybe we're seeing in other places in sort of Jewish communities?
Yeah. So I like your question. But I'm going to take it to a relational place. In other words, I would say as activists, women finding their voice to create repair in society has been important. In relationships, it actually can be maladaptive and dysfunctional, because if we look at relationships that are traditionally patriarchal, and you've had the man, have all the power and the woman not feel any power, if the way that she takes power is to react by using her power in any way possible, all we've done is shift the dynamic to being one down to then being one up. And so the way that would look relationally, for example, would be that the woman would feel that she's been oppressed by her partner, and she will act out. And she will act out that oppression either by being very openly aggressive, or she might be passive aggressive, or she might hold back on sex or anything else just to be able to assert her power. So while on a societal level, on a global societal level, This is something that oppressed communities globally have had to do in order to have their voices heard. Relationally, we really want to no longer value who's on top. We want to value egalitarian, relationship. We want to value equality, and we want to look at both the woman and the man. We don't want to look at any one as being powerful over the other, because men are just as capable of feeling oppressed in a marriage as women. And if we make it about the woman's voice as opposed to the couple, then we've lost sight of what we're trying to do here, which is create something, I would say, even post-feminist and humanist. I think we're past that. I think we want to be able to look at couples who are both partners can be equally vulnerable to each other and can also provide emotional stability and safety for one another, and can repair conflict together. That's and I think that the global part is important, because as women become more powerful and as women feel more independent, they're not in the marriage just for financial security, then we can create relationships that feel more equal.
Wow, very enlightening. I want to ask you, to the extent that you're comfortable sharing, and if not, it's all good. What are some of the things that you have learned personally in your encounters with, your patients that maybe you use in your life, in your marriage?
Oh, okay. That's a great question. I think I learned a lot about what not to say. And, I have very high conflict couples. And I can really see the damage that can come with statements that are hurtful and disparaging, contemptuous behavior. Often, my husband and I will joke if I say something kind of obnoxious, and I'll say, "Oh man, you don't know how lucky you are," because of the kinds of things it's really mind-boggling, the extent to which people are capable, they live together and they can hurt each other, and people, hurt people. So a lot of the work is really getting down to, who did that to you, who shamed you that way, that you would want to do that to your partner. I think that it's been enlightening to know what not to do often. I think I learn from my patients every day. I mean, I think that therapy is very much a relationship. And, it isn't this kind of model of, I know it all and I'm going to tell you what to do. It's really not, that's not how I work. And many sex therapists, by the way, work very behaviorally. I don't work that way. Like, I don't tell people what to do. I don't tell them how to have sex, or if they should have sex, or how often to have sex. But I do teach people how to connect with each other, and how to resolve conflict with each other, and how to communicate in ways that aren't going to provoke defensiveness and aggression, but rather are going to create the possibility of repair, because it softens. And when we say I feel sad, that I feel hurt, or this makes me feel lonely or abandoned, those sorts of statements are far more they're far more liable to instill this kind of sense of curiosity and empathy than, why did you do that? You're such a, you made me feel this way because you and that just makes people feel defensive. So that kind of relational dynamic of communication, I would say a lot of what I do teach behaviorally is communication. Obviously, there's also the psychoeducational element of sexuality. There's a lot of basic things that people may not know, that it's helpful to talk about as well.
I know we spent a lot of time sort of talking about the negative aspects and the negative circumstances around the work you do, but I'm sure there's a lot that we as sort of the non-Orthodox Jewish community and just non-Jews in general can learn from intimacy and sexuality amongst the Orthodox communities. What are some of those things that you think, are sort of transcendental and universal that maybe the non-Orthodox Jewish communities could do a better job of doing in terms of learning from the Orthodox ones?
So I'm going to take that question in a little bit of a different direction, because, I'm not one to preach orthodoxy and why, we who are Orthodox are better. It's not my way, and it's never been my way. But I would like to perhaps talk about the idea of exclusivity and monogamy, and also kind of maybe plug the book that I wrote together with Dr. David Ribner called I Am for My Beloved, A Guide to Enhanced Intimacy for Married Couples, which really does address mostly observant couples, but we have heard that people have told us that the information in there is really relevant to couples, to all couples, regardless of practice. Now, you're right. We have spoken until now a lot about problems. We've brought the issues, and that's the nature of my work. People don't come to therapy unless they have some distress. But I also think that it's a really good opportunity, especially as we're in the month of Elul and it's going to be the High Holy Days, that one thing I could say is that as Jews, one of the kind of messages that we get in terms of our relationship to God is that God and the people of Israel also have this kind of romantic relationship. It's one of the relationships. God is our king and God is our father, but there's also God as lover. And that's kind of an allegory that we see a lot in the Tanakh, in Shir HaShirim, certainly, and certainly also in the times where God is angry, with the prophets, and the prophets are giving this very dooming prophecy that, if you don't shape up, and also there's some kind of shaming ways in which prophets might refer to the people of Israel as being unfaithful, being, I hate to use the word, but being kind of like whores to other gods and that kind of thing. So in a way, that's not what I really meant to bring. What I meant to bring was the good part, which is the part about commitment and loyalty and this kind of mutuality. You follow what I ask you to do. You follow my laws. You are exclusive to me, and I'm going to make things good for you. The problem with that model is the hierarchical part of it, but it's really trying to take one aspect of God as being above us to there is a certain part of our relationship with God where he's also a partner. And we model our monogamy, we model the wedding, the whole kind of wedding service around this idea of monogamy. I will be wedded to you forever. So I think that I have to say that that's not an easy thing. And it doesn't make it easier just because you're Jewish. It doesn't make it easier just because you're Orthodox. Monogamy is hard. It's hard for all populations. And to do it, you need to invest in it. And you need to be really aware of when you're feeling that your needs are not being met, or when you might be feeling other things that have nothing necessarily to do with your partner, but you're restless, or you've been mourning, or somebody else is giving you a lot of attention and it feels good. And being aware of what might be pulling you into something that could challenge or threaten your monogamous relationship. It's something that does need to be thought about and worked on, and not ignored as something that's just not a thing that would never happen. We actually have in our book a small chapter about affairs and infidelity, how to recover from them. Obviously, I see that as well. and it's something that can be devastating when it happens, but it's also something that can really bring a couple back together in a very strong way when they can recover from it.
So yeah, monogamy is a really interesting subject, because there's a lot of people that say that it's not biologically natural, and that we, even if you go back in history and you had certain communities, I'm talking hundreds if not thousands of years ago, where you had many men having sex with the one woman, and sort of as you called it, letting out their seed, and that was sort of seen as a sign of strength for the child to be. So I'm just wondering.
One man having sex with many women, I think, is what you meant to say.
No,
right?
the opposite. The opposite. There's been, and again, we're talking about tribal things. This is not modern day civilization, but many men trying to impregnate a single woman. One of them actually does it successfully, because they wanted the kid to have all of the attributes of all the men in the tribe. I mean, I'm just going back thousands of years ago. But that's, there's no proof there. That's sort of a theory or something along those lines. But I'm just wondering, monogamy today, especially in non-religious circles, especially in liberal and progressive circles. I mean, I live in Tel Aviv, and the thing over the last few years, sort of the trend you hear amongst couples is open relationships and polyamory, and all these types of things. It's not the norm, it's still the exception. But if you were to compare it to maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it's the percentage of couples that are questioning monogamy, wondering if monogamy is right for them, engaging in non-monogamy, is certainly going up, in certain circles at least. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I know you talked about the book and that people can really get a much deeper understanding of that kind of subject, exclusivity, as you call it. But as we wrap up here on this episode, I mean, what are some of the high-level things that you've seen that are great for strengthening monogamy amongst married couples?
If you value monogamy, and you value monogamy not just because you want to keep to the Jewish law, but you also want to keep to the spirit of, what is important, what is an important Jewish value. Monogamy is an important Jewish value, to the extent that even when men were allowed to have more than one wife, that became prohibited. And so once that was equalized, we can value it. Before that, less so. But once it was equalized for men and women, I think we can certainly value that we need to really work on our primary relationship and make that work. So to answer your question, so that's kind of a hard thing to do on one foot. I would say definitely read our book, look at the articles that are on my website. I actually think that probably if I had to, and interviewers like to ask questions that are reductionist, and I'm not very reductionist, but if I had to answer the question, I would say respect. I think that, integrity, respect, if you respect your partner, and you respect yourself, it makes it easier. But I also have to put out there, don't kill yourself over the head. Like, you're not a terrible person if you've acted out. You just have to figure yourself out, figure out why, and kind of help yourself kind of live with the reason for doing that. Understand it, understand what brought you to it. It's just part of your own journey. But yeah, it does take a lot of work. It takes a lot of awareness, and it takes a lot of communication also figuring out what does monogamy mean for you as a couple. Does it mean you can't go out with your work friend for lunch? Does it mean, what does it mean? Everybody's got different boundaries as to, and they should be talked about.
Talli, this has been just a phenomenal episode. Really, I appreciate your time, your insights, your stories. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and I look forward to meeting again one day.